Good morning, everyone. Thank you all for tuning in today. We at the California Air Resources Board welcome you to this remote public workshop to discuss the SB 1013 F-Gas Reduction Incentive Program, or FRIP. My name is Elizabeth Shealy, and I'm the Research Division Chief at CARB. Today, we will discuss the draft guidelines and application process developed with input from our stakeholders. This will be our final public workshop before we open our solicitation period and begin accepting applications. I will now turn it over to Pamela Gupta, who will introduce the CARB team here today and go over logistics.
Thanks, Elizabeth. Good morning, everyone. My name is Pamela Gupta, and I'm the manager of the F-Gas Reduction Strategy section. So in addition to our research division chief, Elizabeth Shealy, today we also have our brand chief, Michael Fitzgibbon, and our HFC team, as you can see on the slide, which includes Anshul, Elizabeth, Glenn, Richie, Catherine. We also have Shannon Dilly from our legal office, and James Tipton and Matthew Ong from California Climate Investments team. One or more of us will respond to your questions, your questions, your questions, your questions, your questions, your questions. Next slide. A few housekeeping and logistics items before we begin today's presentation. The webinar is being recorded. The recording will be available on our website after the workshop. All of us in the CARB team are connecting remotely from different locations. So if we experience any technical problems during the webinar, we ask you to please bear with us. We'll do our best to get it resolved as quickly as able. Please note that we plan to go through sections of the presentation before we open the floor to questions. However, you may submit written questions at any time during the presentation by using the question box in the GoToWebinar control panel. The picture on the slide shows where you can find this feature in your control panel. When typing in a question, please include your affiliation and the slide number that your question pertains to. To streamline today's discussion, we request that you submit all comments and questions by typing them into the question box. Now I'll turn it over to Anshul, the staff lead for the incentive program. Thanks.
Thanks, Pamela. Good morning, everyone. Today's presentation will be broken up in multiple sessions. After each session, we will allocate a few minutes for questions and discussion pertaining to that session. During that time, we will read out the written questions and comments received, and one of the members of the CARB team will respond. This will continue until it is time for the next session. If we cannot get through all of your questions and comments, we will come back to them at the end of the presentation or respond to you directly via email. I will begin today's discussion with the proposed FRIP program materials and application process. Next, I will discuss the FRIP tool that all applicants must use to estimate GHG emission reductions from their proposed project. Then our attorney, Shannon Dilly, will discuss the CEQA requirements that all FRIP applicants must adhere to. Lastly, I will discuss the FRIP award process, the requirements that FRIP grantees must fulfill, and the process for receiving funds, as well as stakeholder feedback we have received thus far on the program materials. Then we will open up the floor once again for a general discussion. To start off today's presentation, I will provide a brief background about the creation of the incentive program and the focus on retail food facilities for this round of funding. SB 1013, the California Cooling Act, which passed in 2018, directed the creation of an incentive program to promote the adoption of new refrigerant technologies. $1 million was allocated by the legislature from the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund, or SB 1013, in the 2019-2020 budget. Programs and projects using funds from the GGRF fall under the umbrella of California Climate Investments and are subject to California Climate Investment requirements. At our last public workshop in January earlier this year, I discussed some of these requirements. We have developed the incentive program in accordance with SB 1013 requirements, California Climate Investment requirements, as well as stakeholder feedback. Moving on, I will discuss the proposed incentive program materials, timeline, scoring criteria, and application process. I want to emphasize that all of these are draft materials. We would like to get your feedback before we finalize them and begin our official solicitation period. Additionally, some of the material I'm about to present today is slightly different from what is in the program guidelines currently on our website. Since we posted those materials on July 10th, we have received feedback and questions and have decided to make some revisions to improve the guidelines. I will try to point out these changes as I'm going through my presentation. Before the solicitation begins, we will post the final materials. Applicants are responsible for preparing an application based on the final guidelines. At our last workshop in January, we proposed that the incentive funding be directed towards refrigeration systems found in supermarkets and grocery stores. So why the retail food sector? Stationary refrigeration, particularly the retail food sector, is one of the largest sources of HFC emissions in California, evident from the pie chart you see on the slide. This sector has one of the highest emission reductions potential because of the high GWP refrigerants that are prevalent in this sector and the availability of commercially ready climate-friendly technologies. A higher incremental cost and lack of familiarity with alternative technologies has prevented their widespread adoption in this sector. Through FRIP, our goal is to alleviate these barriers. If additional funding for SB 1013 becomes available in the future, we will consider including other HFC sectors for incentive funding. To begin the proposed program materials and application process, I'll start with describing the key steps for the program and the proposed timeline. We posted our draft materials on July 10th, and I'll describe these materials shortly. We are currently accepting stakeholder input on the materials until the end of this week, July 31st. We will revise the program materials based on the feedback we receive and post the final guidelines on August 7th, our proposed date for the beginning of the solicitation period. We are proposing a 60-day solicitation period between August 7th and October 7th, and will accept applications during that time. After that, we will evaluate the applications received and announce the awardees likely towards the end of November. Then we will begin developing grant agreements that establish a contractual relationship between CARB and the FRIP grantee, and we expect to have those complete within 3 months of announcing awards. Once the solicitation period begins, CARB staff will not be available to respond to individual questions. Based on the number of questions we receive at the beginning of the solicitation period, we will either conduct an additional webinar or post a frequently asked questions document on our website to answer questions about the application process. So as much as possible, give us your feedback and ask questions prior to August 7th. The FRIP timeline is based on legislatively mandated deadlines for greenhouse gas reduction funds. The first deadline is the encumbrance deadline, which is 2 years after the funding allocation date and falls on June 30th, 2021. By then, we need to complete our solicitation, announce grantees, and execute contract agreements with all FRIP grantees. The other major deadline is the liquidation deadline, which is 4 years after the encumbrance deadline. Greenhouse gas reduction funds are allocated on a reimbursement basis, which means that all funding recipients should have submitted an invoice and received reimbursement before June 30th, 2025 at the very latest, and also completed all the project deliverables by then. Of course, we hope that projects are completed a lot sooner than 2025. Next, I will briefly describe the FRIP program materials. Like I mentioned before, draft materials were published on our website on July 10th. They're available for download. The FRIP program materials consist of several documents. The primary document is the Program Guidelines and Solicitation Manual, or Guidelines for short. You will hear me refer to the Program Guidelines and materials interchangeably at times, since the guidelines include all of these attached documents. Some of these attachments are templates for forms that will be submitted by applicants in response to the solicitation. There is a greenhouse gas quantification tool that all applicants must use to calculate greenhouse gas emissions from their proposed project and submit as part of the application package. Lastly, there are some supporting documents included in the program materials: application checklists, a CEQA example, and a sample draft grant agreement. I encourage all potential applicants to review these materials in their entirety before the solicitation period begins. Please ask questions. Let us know if something is not clear or if we've made any mistakes. Please make suggestions for how we can improve the incentive program so that it is more successful. Next, I will discuss funding eligibility criteria and funding amounts available. Funding is available for existing retail food facilities that have refrigeration systems with more than 50 pounds of refrigerant, and for new retail food facilities that plan to install a refrigeration system with more than 50 pounds of refrigerant. Many of our stakeholders are probably familiar with the 50-pound threshold, which is the same as the lower limit for registration with CARB's Refrigerant Management Program, or RMP. New facilities must plan to submit a building permit application to the local authority having jurisdiction prior to January 1st, 2022, which is the effective date for our proposed refrigeration regulation. We're proposing to split the $1 million into two funding tiers: Tier 1 for innovative technologies and Tier 2 for conventional technologies. Tier 1 is focused on ultra-low GWP technologies with a GWP less than 10 for new and existing stores. We have allocated a total of $600,000 for Tier 1. As for the maximum awards allocated, we are proposing $150,000 for existing facilities, $50,000 for new facilities, or 100% of the cost premium of the ultra-low GWP technology, whichever is lower. Thanks to match funding from the Los Angeles Department of Water and Power, projects located in LADWP territory can receive higher funding amounts of $200,000 and $75,000 for existing and new facilities, respectively. Tier 2 is focused on refrigerant retrofits from high GWP refrigerants with a GWP of about 4,000 to lower GWP refrigerants less than 1,500. We have allocated the remaining $400,000 for Tier 2. There are two types of Tier 2 projects. The first is a refrigerant retrofit only project, and the other is a retrofit combined with a charge reduction of at least 25%. Retrofit only projects are eligible to receive 25% of the cost of a retrofit. If located in a low-income or disadvantaged community or an independent store, applicants are eligible for 50% of the cost of a retrofit. Retrofit and charge reduction projects receive the same amount of funding for the retrofit and also receive an additional $25 per pound of refrigerant that is permanently removed from the system, up to a maximum of 1,000 pounds. During our proposed refrigeration rulemaking, we determined that retrofits on average cost about $45 per pound of refrigerant retrofitted. The funding award of 25% or 50% will be based on this average retrofit cost. Next, I will talk about FRIP funding partners LADWP and Southern California Edison, whom we are very excited to be collaborating with. LADWP has allocated a total of $200,000 for Tier 1 projects located in their territory. LADWP will provide match funding up to $25 per metric ton in CO2 equivalents of refrigerant emission reductions. With this additional funding, FRIP projects are eligible for higher maximum funding amounts. This will allow CARB to fund additional Tier 1 projects. If LADWP funds remain, they may be allocated to Tier 2 projects in low-income and disadvantaged communities. Grantees in this category are eligible to receive up to 50% of the refrigerant retrofit cost. We're also very excited to be partnering with the Emerging Technology Program administered by Southern California Edison. The Emerging Technology Program will provide comprehensive measurement and verification support for Tier 1 technologies. Measurement and verification is critical to validate the field performance of ultra-low GWP technologies and has historically been a barrier to their adoption. M&V support will be available for projects located in investor-owned utility territory and for technologies that have the potential to be scaled. Projects located outside IOU territories will be considered on a case-by-case basis. CARB has invited Southern California Edison to participate in the application review process to identify which projects will be eligible to receive M&V support. Tier 1 applicants must agree to the terms and conditions of the Emerging Technology Program and be willing to share data publicly. Some Tier 2 projects may also receive M&V support. As many of our stakeholders already know, M&V can be very expensive and in many cases just as expensive as the incremental cost of the alternative technology. The Emerging Technology Program's contribution is an asset to FRIP and will certainly enhance FRIP success. Next, I will discuss our proposed scoring criteria for FRIP applications. There will be two scoring stages. The first, administrative in nature, to ensure that basic requirements of the application have been met. Administrative screening criteria will be the same for Tier 1 and Tier 2 projects. Only applications that meet the administrative screening criteria will move on to the technical scoring criteria, which will be different for Tier 1 and Tier 2 projects. There are mandatory and optional elements for the technical scoring criteria for both Tier 1 and Tier 2. FRIP will be a competitive solicitation, which means that projects that receive the highest scores will be awarded funding. If Tier 2 is oversubscribed, ties will be resolved in favor of the applications received first. The administrative screening criteria ensure that we receive a complete and signed application with all of the required documents by the due date and time. Applicants must meet all of the administrative screening criteria to be considered for funding. Moving on to the technical scoring criteria next for Tier 1 technology. The technical scoring criteria were developed to address barriers to adopting alternative technologies. These criteria are also based upon California climate investment requirements and SB 1013 requirements. For Tier 1, we have allocated points for the cost effectiveness of refrigerant GHG emission reductions. We have also allocated significant points for the market potential of the proposed technology. Information exchange in this industry and workforce development are critical factors for the success of low GWP technologies, and we want to fund projects that address these barriers. Hence, those criteria are also included. We provide some points for project readiness to ensure that projects are completed in a timely manner. We received feedback to remove the measurement and verification piece from the application, which we're considering removing because in most cases, the Emerging Technology Program will provide that support for Tier 1 projects. Each of these mandatory criteria must be satisfactorily addressed in order to receive points for the optional criteria, which I will discuss next. Applicants must receive a minimum of 70% to be considered eligible for receiving optional points. We're proposing optional points for technologies that are estimated to be more energy efficient than their traditional HFC counterparts. We chose to keep this as an optional criteria since we know that this information may not be readily available for all projects, particularly those located in existing stores. One of the goals for all California climate investment projects is to increase funding for low-income and disadvantaged communities. While we cannot directly benefit these communities, we are proposing optional points for projects located in these communities. We're also proposing optional points for independent owners and operators, which we define as having fewer than 4 facilities in California. Lastly, we're proposing optional points for existing facilities since converting to ultra-low GWP technologies is a lot more challenging in existing stores. We have received feedback to increase the points for this category, which we are considering. Moving on next to the proposed technical scoring criteria for Tier 2 projects. We have allocated points for projects that will be completed sooner and for projects that take measures to reduce refrigerant leaks during and after a retrofit and improve energy efficiency at the same time. Charge reduction projects receive points for additional refrigerant GHG emissions and the cost effectiveness of those emissions. Similar to the Tier 1 category, we provide preferential points for stores located in low-income and disadvantaged communities, as well as to independent stores. Remember that stores located in these areas and independent stores are eligible to receive 50% of the refrigerant retrofit cost. Low-income and disadvantaged communities can be identified by visiting the Priority Populations map on CARB's website listed here and entering in the address of the project location. The map will identify if that location is in a census tract that is a low-income or disadvantaged community. On the left here, you see an example with the address of the Cali EPA building in downtown Sacramento. This location is in a census tract classified as both as a low-income and disadvantaged community, as indicated by the yellow highlighted area. All FRIP projects must employ certified technicians and must adhere to all refrigerant laws to minimize emissions. This was not explicitly mentioned in the guidelines for Tier 1 projects, as was pointed out to us by a stakeholder. We will clarify that in the final guidelines. A brief discussion on proposed limits for retailers. Retailers may apply for both Tier 1 and Tier 2 funding, and they may submit multiple applications within each tier. Projects by the same retailer must be submitted as separate applications. Retailers are eligible to receive only one award per funding tier, although that may change based on the number of applications received and the funding available. Next, I will discuss the details of the application package for FRIP projects and the submission process, starting with Tier 1. Tier 1 applications must contain all of the 7 documents listed here. Applicants must use the templates provided by CARB for these documents, except for the commitment letter, which must be on the company's letterhead. All of the templates are available on CARB's website listed here. They are draft at this point, but will be finalized when the solicitation begins. The information included in the application package is aligned with the scoring criteria I discussed earlier. I will discuss the project summary, Attachment C, and the engineering assessment, Attachment E, in more detail next. Later on, I will discuss how to calculate the GHG emission reductions from the FRIP tool, Attachment D, and Shannon from our legal office will discuss the CEQA requirements, Attachment G. The project summary is the heart of the application and contains most of the applicant's responses to the scoring criteria. The summary must contain the scope of work, the timeline, and major milestones for installing and operating the proposed refrigeration system. The project budget must include all costs associated with the refrigeration system, the cost premium compared to a traditional technology, if relevant, and the requested funding amount from CARB, as well as LADWP for projects located in LADWP territory. The project budget must be consistent with the information provided in the engineering estimate that I will discuss next, and must also be consistent with the information in the FRIP tool used to calculate the cost effectiveness of emission reductions. Based on stakeholder feedback, it is our understanding that engineering firms and manufacturers often provide free pre-bid estimates for low GWP systems compared to traditional HFC systems. These bids contain the cost, refrigerant charge, and sometimes energy use data. All Tier 1 applicants must provide this type of engineering assessment as outlined in Attachment E. This information is critical to estimating the incremental cost of the ultra-low GWP technology and the emission reductions relative to a baseline. For systems in new facilities, details of a hypothetical R448A or R449A system must be used to establish the baseline refrigerant charge, energy use, and cost premium. As much as possible, applicants are encouraged to provide energy use data for new facilities. For systems in existing facilities, the existing system characteristics will be used for establishing a baseline. A baseline cost of $0 may be used for existing facilities. This information must be the basis for developing the budget in the project summary. Moving on to Tier 2 projects, the following 6 documents must be included in the application package. Once again, applicants must use the templates provided by CARB published on the FRIP website. Similar to Tier 1, the project summary is the primary document with the applicant's responses to the scoring criteria outlined earlier. Applicants must include a scope of work with a timeline and major milestones, as well as a project budget. Applicants must outline the measures that they will take to reduce leaks and improve system performance while conducting a retrofit. The guidelines contain manufacturer resources that applicants may use for reference in determining these measures. Applicants must provide supporting documentation to justify how they meet optional criteria. Please email your completed applications to frip@arb.ca.gov by the final due date in the guidelines. Hand or mail-in delivery is temporarily closed, so we will only accept electronic submissions. Please use the templates provided on the FRIP website and adhere to the page limits in the guidelines. Now we will accept questions on the FRIP guidelines and application process. These hold-off questions related to the FRIP greenhouse gas tool and CEQA process for now, since we will cover those portions right after. I will now turn it over to Richie Kaur to read out the questions and comments we have received thus far.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Anshul. We don't have any questions so far, but we are open to accepting them. And just as a reminder, if you're typing it in, please include your affiliation and a slide number if it's a specific question on a slide. But we don't have any questions so far.
Thanks, Richie. We can move ahead to the next session if we don't have questions. And
actually, they're starting to filter in a little bit. So maybe I can just read this one that we just got.
Sure.
Okay. Kristen Tadonio is asking, and Kristen, could you tell us your affiliation, please? Is it possible that this program will be better funded in the future? And Kristen is from the IGSD. Anshul, do you want to take that?
Sure. Thanks, Kristen, for that question. CARB makes recommendations to the legislature, but the funding appropriations are dependent on the legislature that CARB does not play a role with. Pamela, I don't know if you have anything you want to add to that.
No, thanks, Anshul. This is Pamela. I think you covered it. This is again, this funding came in order to implement the SB 1013, where it established the need for an incentive program. But like Anshul pointed out, it's up to the legislature of how much, if any future funding would be available. But I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thank you, Kristen, for that question. We'll wait 5 more seconds before moving on. All right, we have a question from Helen Walter Terranoni of AHRI, and she states that we greatly appreciate CARB's effort to define this process. We agree that it is important to incorporate energy efficiency impact in the project selection process. Thank you, Helen, for that comment.
I'll just add to that very briefly. Thanks for that comment, Helen. And if you have suggestions for how we can better incorporate it, we'd be happy to hear your suggestions.
Okay, Anshul, we are seeing another comment from Helen at this point, and she's adding that in addition, refrigerant recovery is critical to set the stage for future reclaim and better end of life. We agree with you, Helen, and Anshul, did you want to add anything to that?
I'll just add very briefly, we do require that all FRIP projects are conducted by certified technicians, and to the extent possible, refrigerant emissions are minimized. All existing laws regarding refrigerant emissions must be adhered to, as well as record keeping for how refrigerant was handled for all projects.
And another question from Helen is there any thought to including air conditioning in this program? Anshul, would you take that one?
Yes. So we did consider including a number of HFC sectors for the reasons I outlined earlier, because of the availability of commercially ready technologies and the impact of the retail food sector. We decided to focus on that for this round of funding. We do include integrated HVAC plus refrigeration systems. Those do receive funding. They are eligible for funding. They also receive higher points on greenhouse gas emission reductions, since they'll be avoiding HFCs entirely in the stores. But we don't have a dedicated focus on air conditioning for this round of funding. If and when future funding does become available, we will certainly be open to including air conditioning, including refrigerant recovery and reclaim programs, and developing a program that reduces emissions from other sectors as well.
Thank you, Anshul. Next question is from Brenda Chirino. Brenda, if you could let us know your affiliation. and she asks, can you please let us know what type of refrigerants are allowed for Tier 1? Anshul?
Yes, thanks, Brenda, for that question. Any refrigerant with a GWP less than 10 are allowed for Tier 1 projects. So currently, the options that are available are carbon dioxide, ammonia, propane, and HFOs. Not all HFOs would be eligible, but most HFOs with a GWP less than 10 would be.
And we have another question from Helen of AHRI. Will the projects be focused on technology neutrality, examining greenhouse gas impact rather than specific fluid? Anshul, again, this is you.
Yes, thanks, Richie. I'm not quite sure what you mean by that question, Helen. Um, I do see you're saying that we responded to your question. So unless you have any further questions than that, I will not respond to that. Okay, thanks for the confirmation,
Helen just says, thank you very much. You've answered her question. All right. Let's see. We have another question here from Jireen Ahmed. And the question is, as part of the optional criteria, will there be any points for HVAC refrigerants being part of it? Anshul.
Thanks for that question, Jareen. We do not consider HVAC in the optional points as of now. They are considered indirectly for integrated HVAC plus refrigeration systems in the technical scoring criteria because there will be extra refrigerant emission reductions. So projects that do employ integrated systems will have the advantage of higher emission reductions. If they are more energy efficient, which we have heard from stakeholders that there is the potential of integrated systems being more energy efficient, they will receive points for that, but it's not focused just on the HVAC component alone, since the focus is on refrigeration systems.
Thank you, Anshul, for that. Jareen, thanks you also. That is it. Maybe we can give another 5 seconds and then move on if we don't read any more questions.
That sounds good. Thanks, Richie.
All right, we look good to be moving on. Anshul, over to you.
Okay, thank you. Next, I will discuss how applicants will estimate greenhouse gas emission reductions from their proposed project. All greenhouse gas reduction funds must advance the purposes of AB 32 and SB 32 to support California's climate goals. All applicants must quantify the estimated GHG emission reductions from their project. California Climate Investments, which manages greenhouse gas reduction funded programs across the state, has developed a tool based on peer-reviewed scientific methodologies to calculate GHG emissions. The tool is described in the user guide, which also contains examples of common project types. Excuse me. Applicants must use this Excel-based tool included in Attachment D to quantify emissions and submit this tool with their project-specific inputs in the application package. As a reminder, the tool and the user guide are both proposed at this point. We would appreciate stakeholder feedback and questions on these elements before July 31st. The methods used to calculate emissions are built into the tool And with just a few inputs from the user, the tool automatically outputs the GHG emission reductions and the cost effectiveness of the project. Some of the feedback that we've received so far is that the tool is fairly easy to use. The applicant should first enter project details into the Project Info tab of the tool, then enter refrigeration system specific inputs for the baseline system and the proposed system into the tool, such as the refrigerant type, refrigerant charge. These details should be consistent with the engineering assessment for Tier 1 projects and with RMP data for Tier 2 retrofit projects. The tool automates refrigerant GHG emissions, electricity GHG emissions, and the cost effectiveness of emission reductions. The outputs of the tool must be included in the project summary. This process is best explained by looking directly at the FRIP tool. Elizabeth and I will go through the tool now. We have filled out a Tier 1 and Tier 2 example to review with you. Let's start with a Tier 1 example for a transcritical CO2 system in a new facility. What you see here is an interface of the Excel-based tool developed by California Climate Investments. As you can see in the tool, there are several tabs at the bottom. Some of these require user input, some are for output, and some are just for reference. I will go over the tabs that applicants must use, which are really only the Project Info, Inputs, and Benefit Summary tab. I want to highlight that cells and tabs in green designate required inputs from the user, blue indicates optional inputs, and gray is automated outputs. Yellow fields indicate helpful tips, and black fields are not applicable to the user. So as you can see here, the Project Info and the Inputs tab are shaded in green, and the Benefit Summary is gray. So the only two tabs where users are required to enter information are the Project Info and the Inputs tab. In the Project Info tab, applicants need to fill in basic project info. The funding amounts entered here should be consistent with the project budget and the engineering assessment from the Tier 1 application documents. The end date should be consistent with the end date identified in the scope of work. In the Inputs tab, let's start with the zoomed out view. Users need to identify the project type and enter information about the baseline and proposed system. Based on these inputs, the tool outputs GHG emissions as indicated on the right end of this tab. You can see that there's very little information required from the user as indicated by the green shaded cells. Zooming in a bit more, for this example, we picked a Tier 1 project in a new facility for the project type. You can select your project type by clicking on the drop-down menu in that column. Next, we entered No for an integrated HVAC-R plus refrigeration system for this example. If you were installing an HVAC-R system, you could get extra emission reductions from avoiding refrigerant emissions from the air conditioning system. A No for the HVAC-R causes the inputs for the HVAC system to be blacked out, as you can see here. Next, we entered a brief project description. For the hypothetical baseline refrigeration system, applicants can choose either R448A or R449A from the drop-down menu for the refrigerant type. We picked the first for this example. We entered a refrigeration charge of 1,000 pounds. This charge and refrigerant type are based on the engineering estimate for the hypothetical system in attachment E. The energy use is optional as indicated in blue, but we decided to fill that in for this example as 50,000 kilowatt hours per year. This completes the inputs for the baseline refrigeration system, and next we move to the proposed system inputs. Similarly, we enter the refrigerant type, charge, and energy use. Here we picked a centralized CO2 system with a total charge of 800 pounds. You can also see the option for entering a secondary refrigerant, say for a cascade or indirect system. Scrolling to the right, you can see that the rest of the columns are all grayed out. These numbers are automatically populated or calculated within the tool. The annual leak rate for both proposed and baseline systems is based on Refrigerant Management Program average leak rates, which depend on the system size. A 20% end-of-life leak rate is consistent with California's F-gas inventory. The quantification period or lifetime of the system of 15 years is once again from the inventory and based on stakeholder feedback. Lastly, you can see the GHG emission reductions from the project are separated by refrigerant and electricity and are automatically calculated by the tool. Next, let's go to the Benefit Summary tab to review the cost-effectiveness data. Rows 17 and 18 are particularly important outputs that applicants must include in the project summary. The electricity emissions may be included in the optional criteria for Tier 1 projects. If you look further down, you can view the co-benefits of reducing electricity use. There are some cost savings with reduced electricity use. There's also a reduction in air pollutant emissions due to reduced electricity generation. All of this information is automatically calculated by the tool based on user inputs. That brings us to the end of example 1. Next, we'll cover another example for a Tier 2 project this time, and I'll go over this a little bit more quickly. We picked a refrigerant retrofit-only project for demonstration. Similar to the Tier 1 example, we start by entering information in the Project Info tab. Next, we move to the Inputs tab. We select a refrigerant retrofit in the project type. Since this is an existing system, the baseline refrigerant type and charge size are based on RMP data. We picked R404A and 2200 pounds for this example. For the proposed system, we picked R449A, which has a GWP less than 1500, with a total anticipated charge size of 2250 pounds. The leak rates once again are based on RMP average data, which for large systems greater than 2000 pounds is 24.2%. The quantification period is 10 years in this case, based on CARB's F-gas inventory and stakeholder feedback for refrigerant retrofits. Similar to example 1, if you scroll to the right, you can see the GHG emission reductions output by the tool. Here you do not see any electricity GHG emission reductions since we did not input that data. Let's go to the Benefit Summary tab next to view the cost effectiveness numbers based on FRIP funding received and the total cost of the retrofit. You can see the numbers $4 and $15 per metric ton of CO2 emission reductions respectively. You will not see any electricity GHG emissions or co-benefits since that data was not included for this example. And that brings us to the end of example 2. Now we will take questions on the FRIP tool. I encourage potential applicants to test out the tool and ask questions before the solicitation period, as well as provide feedback. Once again, Richie, I will hand it over to you to read out any questions or comments.
Thanks, Anchal. We have a question from Kristen Tadonio of the IGSD again. And Kristen is asking, are the assumptions in this FRIP tool consistent with the assumptions in the refrigerants avoided cost calculator developed by E3 for CPUC? Anchal, did you want to take that?
Yes. Thanks for that question, Tristan. Yes, they are consistent. The same data that is used in the F-gas inventory is the same data that we shared with the CPUC. The CPUC in their avoided cost calculator is focusing more on decarbonization activities related to the increased use of refrigerants and heat pumps. So there's not a lot of overlap in the data, but the data that we have shared for refrigeration systems is consistent in the avoided cost calculator.
Great. We don't have any more questions, but we can give it about 5 to 10 seconds if people are typing in. Okay. Anchal, I think it's safe to move on. We don't have any more questions. If they do come up later, we can address them at the end of the webinar too.
That sounds good, Richie. Thank you. And I'll turn it over to Shannon from our legal office.
Thank you, Anchal. As mentioned by Anchal, my name is Shannon Dilley, and I'm a senior attorney with the California Air Resources Board. Today, I'm going to discuss the requirements relating to the California Environmental Quality Act, referred to herein as CEQA, as they relate to the FRIP projects. The purpose of CEQA is to identify, prevent, or minimize and disclose environmental impacts associated with a proposed project to the public. Next, I'm going to go over some basic concepts that require mentioning. Okay, so under CEQA, a lead agency is required to determine whether a project may have significant effects on the environment based on substantial evidence. Under CEQA, a lead agency is the public agency with principal responsibility for carrying out or approving a project. This would be the agency with discretionary permit authority, which acts first to approve a project and is responsible for evaluating the environmental impacts and making a CEQA determination. The criteria for determining who the lead agency is are located in the CEQA guidelines. And that's 14 CCR 150151. A project is broadly defined as any discretionary action that has the potential for resulting in either direct physical change in the environment or reasonably foreseeable indirect change. Essentially, an action is considered a project when something is built, funded, or permitted. It can be a project that the public agency directly undertakes, one that is supported through contracts or grants, or one that involves the issuance of a lease, permit, license, certificate, etc. It applies when a project has significant effect on the environment. This means substantial or potentially substantial adverse change in the environment. An example of something having a potential significant effect on the environment would be a project's increase in emissions over an existing baseline of emissions at the project site before project commencement. An example of something not having significant effects on the environment are reporting requirements. And when I say environment, CEQA defines environment as the physical conditions which exist within the area which will be affected by a proposed project. Now, this includes land, air, water, minerals, flora, fauna, noise, objects, and others, but make sure to look at the definition. Another concept that requires mention is the term substantial evidence, and this includes facts, a reasonable assumption predicated upon facts, or expert opinion supported by fact. What it does not include is argument, speculation, or unsubstantiated opinion or narrative, or evidence that's clearly inaccurate or erroneous. So, just make sure that when you make a determination, that there are facts supporting it. Okay, so all FRIP applicants must fulfill all applicable CEQA requirements because their proposed projects are likely to be projects under CEQA. Applicants must submit a CEQA worksheet, which is attachment G in their application package. This is a requirement. The information provided in the worksheet will be the basis for determining the CEQA lead agency and the applicant's compliance with CEQA. A CEQA determination is not required during the solicitation period, and it may be completed after, but before any funds are dispersed. And please note that CARB may cancel the grant agreement if the project does not comply with CEQA, so please make sure to act early. This flowchart indicates the basic process for fulfilling CEQA requirements. Green boxes indicate applicant responsibilities, while yellow boxes indicate public agency responsibility. First, the applicant must describe its project and potential environmental impacts of their project and list these in the CEQA worksheet. They may get guidance from their refrigeration contractor if needed. Second, the application must identify the lead agency. As mentioned earlier, this is typically the agency with discretionary approval on the project. If there is no agency that can serve as the lead agency, then CARB will become the lead agency. The lead agency will evaluate the impacts of the project and may request additional information from the applicant as needed. Now, when conducting an environmental analysis, there are three common outcomes a project can have. One is to be exempt from CEQA. The other is there are no impacts to the environment. And the third category is that there's potential for adverse impacts to the environment. When determining if your project will cause potential adverse impacts on the environment, please keep in mind that an adverse impact causes a substantial or potentially substantial adverse change in physical conditions in the project area. And again, this can be direct or indirect impacts. An example of direct impact would be a project that causes the release of air pollutant emissions above those that the existing project site emits. So i.e., if there's a supermarket on the site and a new supermarket is proposed that would have higher operational emissions than the existing supermarket, the new project's higher operational emissions would be a direct impact. In contrast, an example of an indirect impact would be a project's growth-inducing impact. So if an applicant proposes a new supermarket in an area and where there are no supermarkets, this may encourage new housing and other commercial construction in the area, given the convenience of the new supermarket for potential residents. This new housing and commercial construction impacts would be indirect impacts of the new supermarket project. The lead agency will then issue a CEQA determination. The lead agency may conclude that the project is exempt from CEQA, in which case it will provide a notice of exemption. And a sample notice of exemption is included in attachment G for your convenience. There are also several exemptions from CEQA. For example, ministerial projects, there's a common sense and a categorical exemption, and those are just some. And then lastly, if CARB is not the lead agency, then the applicant must submit documentation to CARB of the lead agency's CEQA determination before CARB can award funds. If CARB is the lead agency, CARB will notify the applicant when a CEQA determination has been made. Some applicants may already have CEQA approval before they apply for FRIP funding, in which case they can include the CEQA notice in their application. Our understanding based on the discussions with stakeholders is that they don't typically conduct CEQA. Rather, this is conducted by the building developer, and applicants may obtain these documents from the developer in that case. So now we will accept questions on the CEQA process. Please note we cannot provide legal advice, and we'll tend to stay away from hypotheticals that ask us to tell if the applicant, if it's a project or if it's exempt, since we cannot provide legal advice. CARB does have a CEQA website if you want more information on CEQA. Recommend reviewing the laws. And then, how you get there is you go to CARB's website, and then up in the little search box, you just type in CEQA and it'll bring you right there. I'm going to turn it over to Richie to read out questions and comments now.
Thank you, Shannon. I think you explained the process really well. We don't see any questions, but should people be typing in, we'll give them a few moments. And of course, if we move along and you are still typing your question, we can come back to it at the end. So please feel free to type in your questions. Okay, I think it's safe to move on. Anchal, over to you.
Thanks, Richie. Next, I will discuss how applications will be evaluated and how awards will be announced. CARB will assemble an evaluation committee consisting of experts from CARB, other state agencies if necessary, and Southern California Edison. All applications will be evaluated using the scoring criteria that I discussed earlier and as indicated in the final guidelines. We will announce awards on our website and include the applicants' names, their score and ranking, project description, as well as the award amount allocated. All applications in their entirety are a matter of public record and will be treated in accordance with the California Public Records Act and Public Contracts Code requirements. If grantees accept the terms and conditions of the FRIP award, then we will execute a grant agreement between CARB and the grantees. This can take about 3 months after the awards are announced. Detailed information is included in Chapter 5 of the guidelines. Grantees are also subject to administrative and technical requirements if they receive a FRIP grant from CARB. Grantees are subject to audits, oversight, and enforcement action in case of non-compliance with the terms and conditions of the grant. Please see Chapters 5, 6, and 7 of the guidelines, as well as Attachment H, the draft grant agreement, for more details. I'll discuss the primary requirements for Tier 1 and Tier 2 grantees, which will be different for both types. For Tier 1 grantees, CARB will have a project kickoff meeting to establish deliverables and roles and responsibilities. Grantees will be required to submit progress reports, most likely quarterly, to ensure that grantees are following the scope of work and timelines submitted in their application. Towards the end of the project, grantees will be required to use the FRIP tool to calculate final GHG emissions from their implemented project. Grantees must submit a draft and final report to CARB. Templates for the periodic progress reports and final report will be provided by CARB. All of these details will be included in the grant agreement executed between CARB and the grantee. Tier 2 requirements are a bit simpler. Grantees will need to submit GHG emission once they know the final charge size after the retrofit and charge reduction project have been implemented. Grantees will also be required to submit a draft and final report to CARB when the project is completed. Applicants must complete all project deliverables before the grant agreement end date. We're proposing that all FRIP projects be completed by June 30th, 2024. This is 1 year in advance of the liquidation deadline. This deadline must align with the scope of work and milestones indicated in the application package. The project end date should be no later than the grant agreement end date. For Tier 1 projects, we require that all systems are operational by June 30th, 2023 to allow at least 1 year of data collection prior to the end of the grant term. Projects with earlier deadlines will be prioritized for Tier 2 funding, but no projects must be completed later than June 30th, 2024 at the very latest. The grant agreement end date was not clearly defined in the program guidelines, so this information is new and revised from what was included in the draft guidelines. Moving on next to the process of disbursement of funds for FRIP grantees. Greenhouse gas reduction funds are disbursed on a reimbursement basis typically. Applicants submit an itemized invoice to CARB after expenses have been incurred, and CARB reimburses applicants for those expenses based on the grant agreement criteria. In most cases, expenses are reimbursed by CARB within 45 days of submitting an invoice. In some cases, applicants may qualify for advance payments. Please refer to the draft grant agreement attachment H for more details on advance payments. CARB may retain 25% of the funds allocated until the completion of the project. For both Tier 1 and Tier 2 projects, we have identified eligible costs and the milestones when applicants can apply for reimbursement. Once again, this information is different from what is contained in the draft guidelines. Based on new information we have received, we are proposing to change the eligibility criteria and disbursement of funds timeline. Tier 1 projects may receive reimbursement for low GWP equipment and installation once they have installed the system and it is operational. Tier 2 projects may receive reimbursement for the cost of the retrofit, including labor and cost of components. They may apply for funding when the refrigerant retrofit and/or charge reduction project has been completed. Next, I will address some questions we have received from stakeholders that clarify the discussion from earlier about funds disbursement. Some of this information in the draft guidelines was not clearly stated. First question, can I apply for FRIP funding even if I have started building my grocery store? As long as the proposed ultra-low GWP refrigeration system has not yet been installed or operated, before the grant agreement has been executed, applicants may apply for funding. Applicants could have already begun planning and construction of their facility before applying for FRIP. What is the earliest date I can request funding if I get an award? Once the grant agreement has been executed and the CEQA requirements fulfilled, funding can be requested for eligible costs at predetermined milestones. Can I receive all of the funding at one time? CARB may retain a portion of the funding until the end of the project. Other than that retained amount, applicants can apply for being reimbursed for all of the allocated funding in one invoice. What is the project end date? When the grantee has implemented the project, fulfilled all of the requirements of the agreement, including measurement and verification, through Southern California Edison's Emerging Technology Program, completed the final report, and submitted invoices for the entire allocated funding amount, then the project is considered complete. The project end date must be no later than June 30th, 2024, which we're proposing as the end date for all FRIP projects. We have received feedback on some aspects of the guidelines from stakeholders, based on which we're considering the following changes. Removing measurement and verification requirements for Tier 1 projects, since the Emerging Technologies Program will provide that in most instances. We will not mandate hands-on training for health and safety reasons and will allow virtual training for workforce development. We also plan to increase the scoring criteria for existing stores from 5 to 10 points for Tier 1 projects, since existing stores face the greatest barriers in transitioning to ultra-low GWP technologies. Once again, we will now respond to questions and comments on the topics I just covered or on any other sections of the presentation. If there are any questions and comments that we are unable to respond to today, we will respond via email or through a frequently asked questions document that will be published on our website. And Richie, I will turn it back to you once again for questions and comments.
Thank you, Anchal. And attendees, we are open to taking any questions you might have. We don't have any questions as of yet that we haven't answered or haven't read out. So please feel free to type them in. We can give it a couple minutes and see. And just to reiterate what Anchal has said all along, we are taking your questions until the solicitation period begins. All right, we have a question from Danielle Wright of the NASRC. Can you confirm if the June 30, 2024 deadline does include 1 year of measurement and verification? Anchal?
Yes. Thanks, Danielle, for that question. Yes, the June 30th, 2024, as we're proposing, does include 1 year of M&V through the Emerging Technology Program. And if you have any concerns about that, Danielle, please feel free to reach out and let us know.
Okay, we don't have any more typed in questions. If there are folks who would like to ask a question verbally, you can do so by raising your hand. So on your control panel, you should see a little icon with a hand with an arrow pointing upwards. If you click that, we can unmute you and then you'll have to unmute yourself. But we'll give it a couple minutes if people want to ask a question verbally. Okay, I don't see any questions, either raised hands or typed in questions that are left unanswered. So maybe we should wrap this up. maybe 5 more seconds to see if any more typed questions are coming in or hand raises.
Thanks, Richie, for doing such a nice job moderating. And I'd like to thank Anshel for the great presentation and the entire FGAS team for pulling this together. I'd like to thank everybody for attending this workshop. And as Anshel has on the slide here, please provide feedback on the guidelines and program materials this week. And again, thanks for participating.
Okay, I think with that, we will end this webinar today. Thank you all for attending and have a nice day.